Hello. Today I'd like to read to you from an essay written nearly 100 years ago by J.B.S. Haldane on being the right size. The most obvious differences between different animals are differences of size, but for some reason the zoologists have paid singularly little attention to them. In a large textbook of zoology before me, I find no indication that the eagle is larger than the sparrow, or that the hippopotamus bigger than the hare, though some grudging admissions are made in the case of the mouse and the whale. But yet it is easy to show that a hare could not be as large as a hippopotamus, or a whale as small as a herring. For every type of animal, there is a most convenient size, and a large change in size inevitably carries with it a change in form. Let us take the most obvious of possible cases and consider a giant man 60 feet high, about the height of giant Pope and giant pagan in the illustrated Pilgrim's Progress of my childhood. These monsters were not only 10 times as high as Christian, but 10 times as wide, 10 times as thick, so that their total weight was 1,000 times his, or about 80 to 90 tons. Unfortunately, the cross-sections of their bones were only 100 times those of Christian, so that every square inch of giant bone had to support 10 times the weight borne by a square inch of human bone. As the human thigh bone breaks under about 10 times the human weight, Pope and pagan would have broken their thighs every time they took a step. This was doubtless why they were sitting down in the picture, I remember. But it lessens one respect for Christian and Jack the Giant Killer. To turn to zoology, suppose that a gazelle, a graceful little creature with long thin legs, is to become large. It will break its bones unless it does one of two things. It may make its legs short and thick like the rhinoceros, so that every pound of weight still has about the same area of bone to support it. Or it can compress its body and stretch out its legs obliquely to gain stability like the giraffe. I mention these two beasts because they happen to belong to the same order as a gazelle, and both are quite successful mechanically, being remarkably fast runners. Gravity, a mere nuisance to Christian, was a terror to Pope, pagan and despair. To the mouse and any smaller animal, it presents practically no dangers. You can drop a mouse down a 1,000-yard mine shaft and, on arriving at the bottom, it gets a slight shock and walks away. A rat is killed, a man is broken, a horse splashes. For the resistance presented to movement by the air is proportional to the surface of the moving object. Divide an animal's length, breadth and height each by 10. Its weight is reduced to 1,000th, but its surface only to 100th. So the resistance to falling in the case of the small animal is relatively 10 times greater than the driving force. An insect, therefore, is not afraid of gravity. It can fall without danger and can cling to the ceiling with remarkably little trouble. It can go in for elegant and fantastic forms of support like that of the daddy longlegs. But there is a force which is as formidable to an insect as gravitation to a mammal. This is surface tension. A man coming out of a bath carries with him a film of water about 1/50th of an inch in thickness. This weighs roughly a pound. A wet mouse has to carry about its own weight of water. A wet fly has to lift many times its own weight, and, as everyone knows, a fly once wetted by water or any other liquid is in a very serious position indeed. An insect going for a drink is in as great a danger as a man leaning out over a precipice in search of food. If it once falls into the grip of the surface tension of the water, that is to say, gets wet, it is likely to remain so until it drowns. A few insects, such as water beetles, contrive to be unwettable. The majority keep well away from their drink by means of a long proboscis. Of course, tall land animals have other difficulties. They have to pump their blood to greater heights than a man, and therefore require a larger blood pressure and tougher blood vessels. A great many men die from burst arteries, especially in the brain, and this danger is presumably still greater for an elephant or a giraffe. But animals of all kinds find difficulties in size for the following reason. A typical small animal, say a microscopic worm or rotifer, has a small, smooth skin through which all the oxygen it requires can soak in, a straight gut with sufficient surface to absorb its food, and a simple kidney. Increase its dimensions tenfold in every direction, and its weight is increased 1,000 times. So that if it is to use its muscles as efficiently as its miniature counterpart, it will need 1,000 times as much food and oxygen per day, and will excrete 1,000 times as much of waste products. Now, if its shape is unaltered, its surface will be increased only 100-fold, and 10 times as much oxygen will enter per minute through each square millimetre of skin, 10 times as much food through each square millimetre of intestine. When a limit is reached to their absorptive powers, their surface has to be increased by some special device. For example, a part of the skin may be drawn out into tufts to make gills, or pushed in to make lungs, thus increasing the oxygen-absorbing surface in proportion to the animal's bulk. A man, for example, has 100 square yards of lung. Similarly, the gut, instead of being smooth and straight, becomes coiled and develops a velvety surface, and other organs increase in complication. The higher animals are not larger than the lower because they are more complicated. They are more complicated because they are larger. Just the same is true of plants. The simplest plants, such as the green algae growing in stagnant water or on the bark of trees, are mere round cells. The higher plants increase their surface by putting out leaves and roots. Comparative anatomy is largely the story of the struggle to increase surface in proportion to volume. I'm going to read a part 2 in a minute, but I'll stop it there.